You're watching Inside the News with Rita Panahi. Now, Australian school students have been thrashed in a new global maths and science exam. I spoke to Dr. Kevin Donnelly earlier today, who explained why. Joining me now is author, senior research fellow at Australian Catholic University, and the man who co-authored a review into the Australian curriculum, Dr. Kevin Donnelly. Thank you for your time. Now, the results are in, and though Australian kids haven't dropped further in international rankings, they are not exactly setting the world on fire, with Year 4 kids coming in at 27th place out of 35 countries for maths and ranked 14 for science, behind Lithuania and the Russian Federation. Is that good enough, Kevin?
It's not good enough, Rita. And I mean, I've been looking at TIMSS and the other international tests, whether it's PISA or PIRLS, over the last 20, 25 years. And the reality is we've always done very poorly compared to other countries. Now, the most recent results with the TIMSS 2019, there is an improvement there in a number of areas. But you're right to point out that in mathematics and science, we're ranked 27 in one, and we've improved in the other two, but still not good enough. And the point being, why are we always outperformed by 8 or 10 other countries, especially the Asian countries, whether it's Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong? There's a lot of work we need to do.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. Year 8 kids did do better in these results, coming in 10th for maths and 9th for science. And interestingly, migrant students in Australia outperformed their Australian-born classmates in Year 8 maths by quite a margin. 26% of migrant kids ranked as high performers, compared to just 10% of children who speak only English at home. What is behind that, Kevin? We see that a great deal of time. We see the elite students often be from migrant backgrounds. Why do you think that is?
It's a difficult one, but I know in Melbourne and Sydney, when you look at the selective government schools, the majority of young kids getting in are Asian or Indian. Melbourne High, where I went many years ago, over 95% of the students are now non-English speaking background. And part of that is the home background. There's a greater focus on, discipline, on working hard, on achieving academically. And so there's a cultural factor there that we need to take into account. The other point I'd suggest, if you've come from another country or you're new to Australia, your family's settling in, there's often an incentive to do well, to establish yourself and to try and improve your life. Whereas a lot of young Australian kids, what I call Anglo-Celtic kids, they're more in tune with, being egalitarian, getting things done the way they want and not being as academically competitive.
Well, there's that whole tiger mum phenomenon that we've heard so much about, and I think you're right, it is generalising, but the stats bear it out. Migrant families often have higher expectations of their kids when it comes to academic performance than a lot of Australian born and bred families. Is that something that we need to change if we are to ever really compete with the best countries in the world when it comes to maths and science?
We do, and that's up to schools as well as parents. But the other point I'd like to make here is that when you look at the Asian countries in particular, but also Russia, Finland, Latvia, they're able to get up to 40, 50% of their students achieving at the outstanding level, whereas Australia, we can only get, say, 10%. So when you look at the top end, we're getting far fewer students doing well. And I think that's a real problem in Australia. We tend to cut down the tall poppies. We tend to focus all the time on disadvantage. We say it's unfair, it's inequitable. We don't want to be competitive. But the reality is, when you look at the latest results, as I said, only 10% of our students are outstanding, whereas Singapore, Japan, South Korea, it's up to 40%.
And quite often there are countries that have really large class sizes. You look at a lot of those Asian countries, the teacher to student ratio is something that, we're not familiar with. That doesn't seem to be holding them back, though.
It's not, and a lot of research has been done over the last 10, 15 years. It's not about money, it's not about resourcing. And in fact, if you look internationally, our schools are quite well resourced and we don't need extra money. What we do need is to look at what's happening in the classroom in terms of teaching practice. And as you know, I reviewed the national curriculum in 2014. We need to have a more rigorous curriculum. We need to set the bar higher, if you like, in terms of expectations, especially in the primary years. We have a very broad curriculum, what the Americans would say a mile wide and an inch deep. So we need to get back to basics. We need to focus on what's essential. We need to have a more effective classroom. Australian classrooms are some of the most disruptive with badly behaved students across the OECD, those countries that do this test. So there are a lot of factors we can look at in terms of improving and strengthening outcomes.
Well, did they not listen to your recommendations when you did the review of the national curriculum? Were your recommendations not adopted?
Well, that's a whole other story, Rita, but unfortunately the short answer is no. Soon after our report, which I delivered to, I co-chaired, we delivered to Christopher Pyne, who was the Education Minister. I think his mind was elsewhere at the time because soon after...
Yes, plotting and white anting, it was mainly on his mind rather than his portfolio, it seemed. Let's have a look at that state-by-state comparison in these results. And you can see for both Year 4 and Year 8 maths and science, it's the ACT in New South Wales on top of the league table. And in all the categories, Northern Territory and Tasmania come in the last two places. Again, is there a reason for that? Is there a reason why ACT New South Wales outperformed the rest of the country?
There are a number of reasons. I mean, one in particular, if you look at the ACT, it's a much smaller, territory in terms of numbers of schools. It doesn't have the same trouble geographically, if you like, as South Australia or even the Northern Territory, where teachers and students, are spread widely across the state and territory. If you compare Northern Territory with a strong Indigenous population, that doesn't happen as much in the ACT or Victoria or New South Wales. So you've got a different group of students, different family, home background. So they're factors that, help explain, if you like, what is occurring in terms of the outcomes. But also the ACT, it's the home of government, the home of the public service. A lot of those parents are well-educated, university qualifications. They are successful.
And affluent, and being affluent doesn't hurt, does it? I mean, all the stats show us that those households, the kids tend to do better academically. Now, I saw this letter to the editor from a teacher, which may explain the current issues we're seeing in education. The teacher writes, I used to teach numbers, but now I teach resilience. I used to teach algebra, but now I teach persistence. I used to teach geometry, but now I teach respectful relationships. I used to teach measurement, but now I teach curiosity. And he goes on, and he says, well, if you're wondering why our maths scores are falling by international standards, then, this could be behind it. But then you've got, on the other hand, the Australian Education Union saying this is a money issue. We need to be pouring more money into the sector to improve our results. What's your response to that?
Well, I think everyone agrees now the consensus is, not just here but internationally, it's not about money. I mean, Andrew Lee, the ALP member for Canberra up that way, he's in federal parliament now. He's done a lot of research here where he argues that, in fact, notwithstanding the additional billions that have been invested in Australia over the last 10, 20 years, standards have gone backwards or flatlined. So it's not about money. Now, you raise a very good point, that teacher does. Our curriculum is very politically correct, very cultural left, as I say, and that's part of the problem. I mean, students spend more time on, safe schools, gender fluidity, striking on the Fridays for climate change, all about gender misogyny. We haven't realised the more time you spend on these politically correct ideologies, the less time you can spend on what really is of value and important.
Absolutely. Dr. Kevin Donnelly, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Rita.